Grant making is always evolving, but right now it is a noisier, faster changing space than usual. I've tried hard to highlight the key issues for you, but I cannot promise to have captured everything. For example, I know I haven't touched on technology. I've divided this presentation into three: before COVID-19, responses to the pandemic, and some ideas for what may stick in the new normal. So let's start in those heady pre-coronavirus days. I'm going to cover three key trends that were going on in grant making. First is climate change. If you remember, this was a big thing pre-COVID-19. Classically, this sector had been woefully under-resourced in the UK, with less than 4% of foundations funding going to the environment. That 4% figure comes from the Green Funders Report in 2014, and since then, in response to the rising awareness, the public pressure and a sense of urgency, more funding was moving into the sector. For example, the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Scottish Natural Heritage launched the Biodiversity Challenge Fund, which had £1 million of investment in 2019-20. When I checked recently, 42 funders had signed the Association of Charitable Foundations funder commitment on climate change, which was launched at the end of 2019 and set out commitments including: we will proactively address the risks and opportunities of a transition to a post-carbon economy in our investment strategy and its implementation. It's interesting to note this shift from grant making to the whole trust or foundation. So here it's not just about the grants you give out, but the alignment of your investments with your mission. This also comes up in the next trend I want to talk about. The next trend is actually a host of things that all come under the category of power. The power dynamic between those that have the money and those seeking it is not new, but there had been much more discussion about this within grant makers, some strong external criticisms, and you were starting to see some changes in approach and practice. At the level of the whole organisation, there were efforts to improve representation in decision makers. The Association of Charitable Foundations conducted a survey of foundation boards and published its findings in 2018. In its own words, bluntly put, it shows a part of the sector that is disproportionately homogenous in terms of race, gender and age, and arguably non-optimal in terms of structure and recruitment practices. That position has not changed much in the latest reports and exchanges around Black Lives Matter, such as the recent ACEVO report. ACF has gone on to deliver its Stronger Foundations initiative that looked at issues of diversity, equity and inclusion, and transparency and governance, and have now come out with their reports and recommendations from a series of working groups. Anyway, back pre-COVID, an example of a UK initiative looking to address the lack of diversity within foundations is 2027, which started in October 2018 and was a £1 million project funded by the Big Lottery and Esme Fairbairn Foundation, which sought to bring more people from working class backgrounds into decision-making roles at trusts and foundations. Issues of equity were also starting to be seen in grant making, with funders applying a gender or racial justice lens to their giving. For example, I did some work with the Oak Foundation's Housing and Homelessness team on using a racial equity lens back last summer. Also, in grant-making practice, there was a shift from transactional grant-making to relational, so a shift in the power where grantees are seen more as partners than recipients of money. There were some changes in practice and processes which were trying to reduce the wasted time and effort spent by applicants and to stop asking organisations to jump through hoops when applying for money. For example, IVAR produced its Duty to Care report in 2019, which set out recommendations such as reviewing all your processes and taking out everything that is not essential. More radical efforts include communities and grant recipients in the decision-making process. These participatory approaches include participatory grant-making or peer-led grant-making or community grant-making. For example, the Frida Feminist Fund take the approach that young women and girls around the world shouldn't just be a cause to donate to or an issue to vote for. We should be the ones making the decisions. So applicants work together to determine how Frida's grant-making funds are allocated. And linked to the changes in power was an increase in trust. You could see this in a rise in core and unrestricted funding. I like this quote from Gilly Green, who was at Comic Relief, and this comes from Esme Fairbairn's report, Insights on Core Funding. She says, core funding means we are saying we believe in your organisation, we like what you're doing, and we're going to give you money for you to use in the way that you see best, provided you use it to deliver your vision and mission. By core funding, we are saying that we trust you to deliver well. And you also see it around impact. So after years of focusing on measuring, monitoring and proving impact, I think the pendulum is swinging back a little. So philanthropist Isa Bosch, who wrote this book, Giving Trust, puts it really well. It seems to me we've gone overboard in overemphasising impact measurement. We've neglected the force of trust. And the last trend I want to mention is around collaboration. Again, this has been something that's been on the agenda for a long time. But an understanding of the complexity of interrelated issues and things like climate change that are just too big to tackle alone sort of rise in collaborations. So you have Comic Relief, Paul Hamlin Foundation, co-funding Tech for Good, or you have networks like the Environmental Funders Network and Early Years Funders Group and the Maternal Mental Health Alliance, so more issue-based collaborations. Then along came COVID-19, which demanded an urgent response from grant makers. Grant makers responded by mobilising new funds. This data comes from 360 Giving's COVID tracker. In some cases, this was making more funding available to existing grantees, such as Esme Fairbairn Foundation, which made rapid response grants to the majority of the organisations it was already supporting. It was basically equivalent to another 6 months funding with no application process. There were countless other new programmes launched. For example, Cloth Workers launched an emergency capital programme, the Arts Council released emergency financial support for artists, and you will all have seen the lists of all the different programmes and emergency funding that came out. Grant makers have also adapted their processes. Over 350 funders signed the We Stand With the Sector pledge, coordinated by London funders. Grant funders are committed to 4 main ways of working. These are adapting activities, discussing dates, financial flexibility, and listening, so encouraging frank conversations between funders and grantees. For existing grantees, there's been flexibility around deadlines, how funding can be used, and reporting requirements. For example, William Grant Foundation switched all its grants over to unrestricted. For new applicants, the decision-making process has been sped up, and there's been a different attitude to risk, which has seen streamlined due diligence to get the money out quickly. It's been a great response to get funds out to communities affected so quickly. However, there have also been some problems. It's been hard for grant seekers to keep on top of all the new programmes and complete the applications to tight deadlines, and often without their full team around to help them, many have been furloughed. Whilst listening is good, I've heard from fundraisers who are tired of having to fill in lots of surveys from funders asking how they've been expected and what they need. Funders have also collaborated in response to COVID. Already a trend, as we saw earlier, more funders came together to pool resources. So, for example, the National Emergencies Trust received donations from all these different charitable trusts and used the Community Foundations network to get funding out quickly to grassroots organisations. London Community Response saw more than 50 funders contribute over 18 million. The issue of equity has also come into sharp focus. This is my hometown of Bristol after the toppling of Colston's statue. Black people and other ethnic minority groups are more likely to be affected by COVID-19. This is true of the higher infection and death rates and also the sector as a whole. Ubailey Initiative's research found that 9 out of 10 Black and minority ethnic, micro and small organisations are set to close. And women too are more likely to be adversely impacted. The recent UN policy briefing included these examples. So economic impacts are felt especially by women and girls who are generally earning less, saving less, holding insecure jobs, living closer to poverty, more likely to be involved in unpaid care work, with children out of school, with heightened care needs of older people and overwhelmed health services. Gender-based violence is increasing exponentially, and many women are being forced to lock down at home with their abusers at the same time that services to support survivors were being disrupted or made inaccessible. The virus has shone a light on existing inequalities in our society. Some grant makers have responded with focus programmes such as the Racial Justice Fund and Rose's Emergency Response Fund for Women and Girls. So what can we expect for grant making post-COVID-19? Well, grant makers and their funding are going to be more needed now than ever. Whilst much is uncertain, what we do know is that we're going to be moving into recession and austerity. The most vulnerable and disadvantaged will continue to be the worst affected. Needs are going to include a rise in unemployment, especially for young people, increased attainment gap in education. Digital exclusion will be more important as services all move online, and the gap in charities' capacity to deliver digitally will need addressing. In terms of mental health, half of frontline healthcare workers are already experiencing PTSD symptoms, and more than 63% of the population report feeling depressed or anxious because of COVID-19. The pandemic will significantly increase the prevalence of mental disorders. The sector is going to be massively impacted. UK charities are reporting a projected loss of 48% to their voluntary income and a third wiped from their total income this year. Over half say they will close within the next 6 months without additional financial support. There's been a call for grant makers to spend more to meet this huge amount of need, which for many could be tricky where investment income has fallen. Recently, the Ford Foundation announced it was going to borrow £1 billion so that it can substantially increase the amount of money it distributes. For grant makers, the focus is now shifting from the emergency response to the longer term. You'll see phrases like rebuilding the future, supporting recovery, building resilience. Some of the new funding programmes reflect this shift. Some of these are still relatively short term, such as the Armed Forces Covenant Trust's COVID-19 Impact Fund. They're kind of moving from funding immediate help like food parcels and helplines to more general support for vulnerable people affected and funds for the next 6 months. There'll be a need for grant makers to also look at longer term funds beyond this to support the sector as it returns from lockdown with reduced income and increased demand. And you're starting to see these being launched as well. So, for example, BBC Children in Need's COVID-19 Next Steps grant programme has grants for 18 months, and you've just got Comic Relief's Changemakers programme, and you'll have seen several others that have recently been launched. The issue will be which of the trends I've mentioned will stick and what new ones might there be. There's a continued need for everything I've mentioned, and if anything, the drivers for each is amplified. Climate change has not gone away. Collaboration will continue with its upward trend as the challenges remain too big not to pool resources. The continued shift in power dynamics, including the focus on equity, the need for core funding, and the sense in streamlining processes and decision-making will all stay. In my view, there are two trends I think will be important. First is the shift from a giving out grants to a whole organisation approach. I think it will become increasingly important for grant makers to be transparent about the source of their wealth, to deal with any issues that brings up, to look at all their assets and ensure these are aligned with their charitable objectives, to consider who is involved in making decisions and how representative they are of those they seek to serve. Which leads me to my second point. I think there's going to be more focus on structural and systemic inequality. The pandemic has highlighted our global connections. The environment is linked to social justice issues. Vulnerable groups are most affected by climate change, most affected by pandemics. All these issues are connected. So I think grant makers will move from single issues such as plastic to more systemic responses such as a low carbon economy or a just economy or an alternative economy. I think we'll move from direct responses supporting disadvantaged groups to looking at the underlying structures that lead to poverty, disadvantage and injustice. I think this means an increased focus on root causes, on policy, social movements, justice, prevention and early intervention. You will all have seen the calls in response to Black Lives Matter protests, with people wanting real change to structures, not just words. And I think that focus on structural and systemic change will be important going forward. You'll have noticed that these are linked. They both look at structure, but one is internally focused, looking at the whole of a grant-making organisation, and the other is externally focused. A whole organisation approach is really about grant makers examining where they fit within the structures that support inequality and decide how best to reduce those power imbalances. This is how Darren Walker of Ford Foundation put it at a talk at the British Academy last year. Moving from generosity to justice requires the philanthropist to get uncomfortable. It requires philanthropy to interrogate some of the very systems and structures that produce our advantage. It looks like we're all lucky to be involved in grant making at such an interesting time.